For the first 2 years of the Pacific War, the Japanese Navy operated with a distinct philosophy: the day belongs to the brave, but the night belongs to the skilled. Japanese sailors and pilots were trained rigorously in night operations. They had superior night optics, massive binoculars, and flashless powder. They used this advantage to torment the American forces. On islands like Guadalcanal, and later Saipan and Peleliu, the nights were not for sleeping. They were for washing machine Charlie. This was the nickname given to the lone Japanese bombers, usually Mitsubishi G4M Bettys or seaplanes, that would drone over American lines after dark. Their engines made a distinct, unsynchronized throbbing sound, like an old washing machine. They rarely caused massive damage. That wasn't the point. The point was sleep deprivation. Every time Charlie flew over, the air raid sirens wailed. The Marines had to dive into muddy foxholes. The anti-aircraft guns opened up, creating a racket that shattered the silence. Charlie would drop one bomb, circle around, drop another, and fly home laughing. The Japanese pilots felt untouchable. They knew the Americans relied on visual sighting. In the pitch black of a moonless tropical night, an airplane painted green or black was effectively invisible. Japanese commanders mocked the American response. They saw the wild flak barrages as a sign of panic. The Americans are afraid of the dark, they joked. They believed that night was their sanctuary. It was the time when they could move supplies, reinforce troops, and harass the enemy without fear of the deadly American fighter planes that ruled the daylight. They viewed the night sky as a cloak of invisibility that technology could never pierce. They were wrong. The Americans weren't just afraid of the dark, they were furious at it. And in the laboratories of MIT and the hangars of Grumman, they were building a flashlight that would burn through the cloak. Before the radar fighters arrived, the American attempt to stop the night raiders was a comedy of errors. The primary defense was the searchlight. Batteries of 60-inch carbon arc searchlights would sweep the sky, trying to catch a Japanese bomber in their beam. The theory was that once the plane was illuminated, the anti-aircraft guns or a waiting day fighter, like a Pu-38 or Wildcat, could shoot it down. In practice, it was a disaster. The searchlights gave away the position of the American base. They were giant "Maim here" signs for the Japanese bombardiers. When the lights did catch a Japanese plane, the pilot would simply dive or turn violently into the darkness, blinding the gunners with the sudden change in contrast. The U.S. Army tried to use the P-70 Nighthawk, a modified A-20 bomber painted black. It was heavy. It was slow. It struggled to climb high enough to catch the Japanese intruders. The Japanese pilots flying the nimble Betty bombers could easily outrun or outmaneuver the sluggish P-70s. Reports from Japanese air crews described the American night defenses as a sound and fury, signifying nothing. They would fly through the flak, watching the tracers arc harmlessly below them, and feel a sense of total superiority. They believed that night combat required cat's eyes, a biological trait of superior night vision that they believed Japanese pilots possessed and Americans lacked. They dismissed the idea of blind fighting. How can you shoot what you cannot see? This arrogance led them to neglect their own night fighter development. They didn't build a dedicated night interceptor because they didn't think they needed one. They were fighting a biological war. The Americans were preparing to fight an electronic war. While the Japanese were training their eyes to see in starlight, the Americans were training electrons to see through clouds. The solution to the Charlie problem arrived on the deck of a carrier in 1944. It was the Grumman F6F Hellcat. To a casual observer, it looked like a standard Hellcat, the rugged, square-jawed fighter that was already decimating the Zero in daylight. But there was an ugly growth on its wing. On the outer starboard wingtip, there was a large, bulbous white pod. It looked aerodynamic ruin. It looked like a tumor. Inside that fiberglass dome sat the antenna for the AN/APS-6 radar. This wasn't the primitive radar of the early war. This was a microwave centimetric radar. It was compact enough to fit on a single-engine fighter, yet powerful enough to detect a bomber at a range of 5 miles. The F6F was a dedicated night hunter. It was painted in gloss sea blue or sometimes matte black to disappear against the ocean. Grumman engineers had also changed the armament. Standard Hellcats carried 6.50 caliber machine guns. The Night Hellcat swapped 2 of those machine guns for 2 20mm cannons. Why? Because at night, you only get one chance. You don't have time for a long, sustained burst to whittle the enemy down. You need a knockout punch. The flash of the .50 calibers could also blind the pilot's night vision. The cannons had flash suppressors and hit harder. The Japanese pilots, if they saw these planes on the decks of American carriers during the day, likely dismissed the pod as a fuel tank or a camera. They didn't realize it was an eye. They didn't realize that the clumsy-looking bulb was emitting a beam of energy that could lock onto them in the deepest darkness. The Night Cat was ugly, asymmetrical, and heavy. But it was about to turn the Pacific night into a shooting gallery. The most terrifying aspect of the Night Hellcat wasn't the plane itself, it was the job of the pilot. In the British RAF, night fighters like the Mosquito had a crew of 2. A pilot to fly, and a radar operator to watch the screen and give directions. The US Navy decided that one man could do it all. Imagine the workload. The pilot is flying a 2,000 horsepower fighter plane, alone, over the ocean, at night. He has to navigate. He has to fly the plane. He has to talk to the ship. And now, he has to read a radar scope. The cockpit of the F6F was designed for the dark. All the instrument lights were red. Red light does not destroy human night vision, purple the visual purple adaptation. In the center of the instrument panel, dominating the pilot's view, was the radar scope. It was a small, round cathode ray tube glowing with an eerie green light. The pilot had to learn to interpret blips. A smudge of light at the top of the screen meant a target ahead. He had to stare at this glowing green eye, interpret the distance and heading, and fly the plane to match the dot. He was flying blind, putting his life in the hands of vacuum tubes and copper wire. If he stared at the bright green light too long, he would be scope blinded and unable to see the enemy plane when he looked out the window. So, he had to scan. Scope, instruments, darkness, scope. It was a task that induced vertigo and extreme fatigue. Only the best pilots were selected for night fighter training. They needed exceptional instrument flying skills. The Japanese pilots relied on their eyes. They scanned the horizon for silhouettes. The American pilot didn't look out the window. He looked at the dashboard. He was stalking his prey mathematically. When the Japanese pilots saw a Hellcat diving on them out of the pitch black, firing cannons with pinpoint accuracy, they were baffled. How did he see me? He didn't. The machine saw him. The red cockpit was a world of solitary, high-tech terror, but it was the environment where the Japanese dominance of the night came to die. The U.S. Navy called the night fighter pilot the one-man band. It was an apt description. He had to play every instrument simultaneously. The training was brutal. It happened in the United States, far from the combat zones, at specialized bases like NAS Vero Beach in Florida. Pilots spent dozens of hours in the Link trainer. This was a primitive flight simulator, a small blue box mounted on bellows that moved to simulate flight. Inside the pitch-black box, the pilot sat with a hood over his head, staring at a simulated radar scope. An instructor sat outside, drawing targets on a chart that appeared as blips on the pilot's screen. The pilot had to fly the plane, talk on the radio, intercept the target, and shoot it down, all without ever seeing the outside world. It was mental overload. They were taught GCI, ground-controlled interception, procedures. The pilot was not a free hunter. He was a guided missile. He was controlled by a fighter director officer, FDO, on the ground or on a ship. The FDO would guide him to within a few miles of the target using the ship's big search radar. Only then would the pilot turn on his own APS-6 airborne radar. This was critical. If he left his radar on all the time, the Japanese might detect the emissions and run away. He had to learn to sniff. Turn the radar on for 2 sweeps, mark the target, turn it off. Fly to the spot. Sniff again. It was a high-stakes game of hide and seek. Many pilots couldn't handle it. They washed out, suffering from instrument vertigo or the inability to multitask under pressure. Those who graduated were a special breed. They were cool, detached, and highly technical flyers. The Japanese pilots were trained in the art of the dogfight, the instinctual, visual battle. The American night fighter pilot was trained in the science of the intercept, a mathematical procedure executed in the dark. Before a night fighter could shoot, it had to remain invisible. A standard F6F Hellcat at night was a beacon of light. The massive Pratt & Whitney ARD2800 engine spat long tongues of blue and yellow flame from its exhaust stacks. From the rear, a Hellcat looked like a blowtorch. A Japanese tail gunner could spot it from miles away. The night Hellcat had to be stealthy. Grumman engineers fitted specialized flame dampers or shrouds over the exhaust stacks. These metal covers channeled the exhaust gases and hid the visible flame from almost every angle except directly below. Suddenly, the fiery blowtorch became a faint blue glow, visible only at very close range. Then there were the guns. A standard .50 caliber machine gun round uses powder that creates a brilliant flash when fired. At night, firing 6 guns was like setting off fireworks right in front of the pilot's eyes. It would ruin his night vision instantly. The Navy developed special flashless ammunition. The powder had chemical additives that suppressed the muzzle flash. Combined with flash hiders on the gun barrels, the night Hellcat could fire without blinding its own pilot. These were small technical details, but they were vital. The Japanese pilots were used to seeing the muzzle flashes of their attackers. It gave them a warning to evade. Now, they were being hit by bullets that seemed to come from nowhere. The night Hellcat was a shadow. It moved in silence, the engine noise was drowned out by their own engines, it didn't glow, and it didn't flash when it killed. The Japanese, masters of the night attack, were now being stalked by a ghost that had mastered the art of not being seen. The night Hellcat pilot was the sword, but the fighter director officer, FDO, was the arm that swung it. The interception began hundreds of miles away, in the Combat Information Center, CIC, of an aircraft carrier. The CIC was a dark, cramped room glowing with radar screens and grease pencil plotting boards. The ship's long-range radar, the SK or SP sets, would pick up a bogey, unidentified aircraft. The FDO, watching the blip, would determine its course and speed. He would then get on the radio to the Combat Air Patrol, CAP, of night Hellcats orbiting nearby. Stardust 1, this is base. Vector 030 for Stranger. Angels 10. Distance 40 miles. Buster. Translation, turn heading 030 degrees to intercept unknown target. Altitude 10,000 feet. Full speed. The pilot would acknowledge and turn his plane. He was flying entirely on trust. The FDO was playing a game of geometry. He had to guide the faster fighter to a point in space where it would converge with the slower bomber, preferably from behind. The Japanese pilots flying the bombers had no idea they were being tracked. They were flying in radio silence. They believed their isolation was their protection. As the distance closed to 5 miles, the FDO would give the final command. Stardust 1, your target is 12 o'clock, 5 miles. Take over with Judy. Judy was the code name for the APS-6 airborne radar. This was the moment of truth. The pilot would snap on his own radar. A bright blip would appear at the top of his scope. He was on his own now. The FDO had done his job. He had delivered the hunter to the prey. This coordination between ship and plane was something the Japanese never mastered. Their radar was too primitive, their radios too unreliable. The Americans had turned night combat into a team sport. The final phase of the intercept was the most delicate. The Hellcat pilot is now flying by his own radar scope. He is closing in on the Japanese Betty bomber at 150 miles per hour relative speed. He has to slow down. If he overshoots, he'll fly right past the bomber and have to start all over again. He throttles back. He drops flaps to slow down. He creeps up behind the target. For miles, 3 miles, 1 mile. He is staring at the green scope, maneuvering his plane to keep the blip centered. At 500 yards, he looks up from the scope. He strains his eyes into the blackness. He is looking for the exhaust flames of the bomber. He is looking for a silhouette blocking out the stars. There it is. A dark shape against the slightly less dark sky. The faint blue glow of the Mitsubishi engines. The Japanese crew is completely unaware. The tail gunner is scanning the darkness, but he sees nothing. The Hellcat is below and behind him, its exhaust shrouded. The American pilot creeps closer. 200 yards. 100 yards. He is so close he can see the rivets on the bomber's skin. He is in the saddle position, slightly below the bomber's tail, where the defensive guns cannot depress low enough to hit him. The tension in the cockpit is immense. The pilot's heart is pounding. He flicks the gun safety switches to ON. He places the illuminated gun sight pip, turned down low so it doesn't blind him, on the wing root of the bomber, right where the fuel tanks are. The Japanese pilots mockingly called the Americans cowards for relying on technology. But there was nothing cowardly about flying a fighter plane to within 100 yards of an enemy bomber in pitch blackness. It was an act of supreme technical skill and cold-blooded nerve. The stalk was over. The execution was about to begin. The final shock for the Japanese bomber crews was the weapon that killed them. The standard American fighter armament was the .50 caliber machine gun. It was reliable, but it took a lot of hits to bring down a twin-engine bomber like the Betty. At night, you don't have time for a lot of hits. You have a split-second window. The night Hellcat, F6F5N, packed a nasty surprise. Two 20mm M2 cannons. These cannons fired explosive shells. When the American pilot finally pulled the trigger at 100 yards, the effect was devastating. He would fire a mixed burst of .50 caliber and 20mm rounds. The 20mm shells would tear into the fuel tanks of the Japanese bomber. Because Japanese planes lacked self-sealing fuel tanks and fire suppression systems, they were flying Zippo lighters. The result was almost instantaneous. Boom! A massive fireball would erupt in the darkness. The flash was so bright it would temporarily blind the Hellcat pilot, even with his red goggles. He would have to pull up violently to avoid flying through the debris field of the exploding enemy. For the Japanese crews in the other bombers nearby, this was terrifying. 1 minute, they were flying in formation. The next, their wingman had turned into a miniature sun. They hadn't seen a tracer. They hadn't seen a fighter. They were being picked off by an invisible assassin with a heavy caliber rifle. The psychological impact of the 20mm surprise was profound. Japanese pilots began to report that the Americans had developed a supergun or a death ray. They couldn't comprehend how they were being hit so hard, so fast, from the darkness. The night Hellcat didn't just shoot them down, it obliterated them. By 1945, the Japanese strategy had shifted to desperation. The kamikaze. Most kamikaze attacks happened at dawn or dusk, the twilight war. But the Japanese commanders, realizing that the American Combat Air Patrol, CAP, was impenetrable during the day, began to launch suicide missions at night. They hoped to sneak in under the cover of darkness. This was the ultimate test for the night Hellcat. Intercepting a bomber flying straight and level is hard. Intercepting a suicider maneuvering to crash into a ship is a nightmare. The radar-equipped Hellcats were stationed on the perimeter of the fleet, the picket line. Their job was to stop the kamikazes before they could see the ships. It was a frantic, high-speed game of tag. The Hellcat pilots had to vector onto the incoming bogies quickly. They had to identify them as hostile, which was hard at night. Friendly fire was a constant risk. And they had to shoot them down completely. A damaged kamikaze could still crash into a destroyer. The Hellcat pilots flew aggressively. They would close to point-blank range to ensure the kill. They shot the wings off. They exploded the cockpits. They were the goalies of the fleet. If a night Hellcat missed, 1,000 sailors might die. The pressure was immense. Pilots flew double shifts. They lived on coffee and adrenaline. But they held the line. The Japanese night attacks failed. The divine wind could not blow in the dark because the radar eye saw it coming. The Japanese commanders who had mocked the Americans for being afraid of the dark now found that the darkness was filled with American teeth. The mastery of night fighting was not achieved without cost. It was paid for in blood. And the most famous casualty was Lieutenant Commander Edward Butcher Hare. Hare was a legend. He had saved the carrier Lexington in 1942 by single-handedly attacking a formation of Japanese bombers. He was the Navy's first ace. In November 1943, near the Gilbert Islands, the Japanese were launching night torpedo attacks. The Navy tried a bold experiment, a Black Panther team. One radar-equipped Avenger torpedo bomber, acting as the eyes, leading two Hellcats, acting as the shooters. Hare led the Hellcats. They took off into the pitch-black night. They found the Japanese bombers. A confused, chaotic melee ensued in the darkness. Tracers flew everywhere. The Avenger's turret gunner fired. The Japanese fired. In the confusion, Hare's plane vanished. He was never seen again. It is likely he was hit by friendly fire from the Avenger, or perhaps by a Japanese lucky shot. His death shocked the Navy. It proved how incredibly dangerous night fighting was. In the dark, it is hard to tell friend from foe. It is hard to judge distance. It is hard to survive. But Hare's sacrifice was not in vain. The Navy learned from the Black Panther experiment. They realized that mixing plane types was too complex. They switched to the single-seat night Hellcat doctrine. They simplified the procedures. They improved the IFF, identification friend or foe, or signals. Hare had walked into the darkness so that others could learn how to see in it. His loss was a tragedy, but it was the tuition fee for the eventual dominance of the night fighter squadrons. When the war ended in August 1945, the night sky over the Pacific belonged to the United States Navy. The Japanese Air Force had been driven from the daylight by the standard Hellcats and Corsairs. And they had been driven from the night by the radar-equipped F6F-5N. There was no sanctuary left. The Japanese doctrine of night superiority had been dismantled by American technology and training. The mocking laughter of 1942 was gone. The Japanese pilots who had once terrorized the Marines with washing machine Charlie raids were dead or grounded. The U.S. Navy had proven that you don't need cat's eyes to fight in the dark. You need a cathode ray tube and the courage to trust it. The legacy of the night Hellcat is the modern concept of all-weather warfare. Today, we take it for granted that jets can fight at night. That capability started in the cockpit of a clumsy-looking Hellcat with a bulb on its wing, flown by a pilot who was brave enough to fly blind. The F6F-5N didn't just win battles, it conquered an element. It stole the night from the enemy and turned it into a weapon. And as the sun rose on VJ Day, the radar scopes were finally turned off, their job done. The darkness had been tamed.